Make no mistake, bias is rooted in frustration, angst, and outrage. With bias, it's not just that the individual believes, it's the outrage that's deserved to the rest of the world, one that's too sheepish, uninformed, or resistant to reach the same conclusion. And that conclusion is that the bias's claim is truth. That's an important component of bias, and it, in part, drives the need for reinforcement, reinforcing the false reality of the bias by getting others to believe in it too. This can also feed the ego because bias fuels an us versus them mentality, because there will be those that believe the bias, and they often shun those that don't. They may not shun them physically, but they acknowledge that those people are less in the know. This is a very important aspect of bias because it causes division and distrust, all around allegiance to the bias's claim. This is also what fuels an inflated view of self, a pride built on false constructs, and that, in part, is why biases are defended so fiercely. One way in which bias differs from opinion is that it actively seeks conflict. It seeks to exert itself, to reaffirm itself to the individual and to drive behavior that seeks to impose that bias onto others. That's how bias is fed. That's how bias is fed within individuals, and that's how bias is fed across society and social media platforms. Bias can linger in a professional environment. There are biases towards specific individuals, teams, or groups that can cause processes to be circumvented. This actually happens in some corporate cultures, where one department or one team gets marginalized by the rest, until people just stop working with that department or team based on the stigma. Here, we define stigma as a set of bundled biases that are specifically directed and aligned towards a common foe. Not that it's surprising in the least, but it's often half-truths, overstatements, stereotyping, or just plain ignorance that comprise the origin, the root from which biases grow. IT departments or teams are often on the receiving end of these types of bias. They are intrusive to the workplace, difficult to work with, not very sociable. The list goes on. Those employees that embrace those biases cause division through the company, forcing difficult conversations and a potential headache for the HR department. Employees end up divided, and feelings get hurt when emotions run high. I think that we can all safely say that nobody deserves to be treated disrespectfully. At work, at home, on vacation, period. When people are routinely subjected to disrespectful behavior, especially when that behavior is coming from peers, people tend to feel threatened, uncomfortable, and generally negative. That negativity is tangible and contagious, and that's what can also happen with bias. It can creep into an organization and grow, unnoticed for some time before leadership realizes just how problematic the bias has become. Those narrow views and dismissive behavior hurt collaboration. They hurt innovation, and they divide groups into those that believe versus those that do not. Are there examples that we could point to in which companies have a massively divided workforce, yet they are highly successful at not just being profitable, but successful in retaining their best talent? An example like that is hard to come by. Where does this lead? Over time, division leads to insulting and disrespectful behavior. A complete collapse of communication as recognition spreads that there's no one that's actually willing to take on the elephant in the room, because those are difficult conversations to have. That's a heavy haul, especially with a fragmented culture. Left alone, the biases exist and grow until division, resentment, and angst become tangible and problematic across departments and across the organization. Lingering biases are often at fault for the skewing of morality of the corporate culture, and that in turn can drive decision-making, driving the decisions that a company makes and the direction that it takes. So what can we do about bias? The most important first step is to recognize that bias exists. But how can that be done when the bias keeps us from being objective in the first place? That's where mental focus, resolve, and some discipline come into play. We don't just look for bias once and then we're done, because it requires that we reassess periodically, continuing to exercise that objectivity as we look inward. For some, it will be easier to recognize bias in others, but no one can ever overcome their own biases until they make the effort to look inside themselves, honestly and objectively. It takes looking inward and assessing where bias exists, what type of bias it is, and what can be done to overcome the bias. That's the path to a better understanding of who we are, and a path to greater satisfaction and contentment with life. Recognizing bias is important. It helps to keep bias in the forefront of our minds. There are 3 key steps to bias recognition. Step 1. Recognize that a bias exists. Step 2. Determine the type of bias. What position is it biased towards? What is the claim of the bias? And step 3. Assemble an approach to stay free from the bias. 1, then 2, then 3. Then execute on your approach. This approach could include a recognition of what objectivity in the situation might look like. Use that as a starting point, as something to aspire to. What would the most objective approach even look like? Where is the objectivity lacking with that stance on the topic? Where is the bias present? What is the perceived consequence of not taking action? Where is the outrage directed at? And how does the bias's claim rationalize that outrage? This focus on bias recognition is a great exercise to begin building a stronger, disciplined mind, one with more control over our own decisions and actions. If given the choice, who would choose to be led around by false constructs of reality? Who would choose to be restricted to a narrow way of thinking? Who prefers the manipulation of behavior over free thinking and free acting behavior? When we put objectivity in that context, it's a pretty straightforward choice. But why do we have such a difficult time keeping things in that context? That's the real question. And that's where bias manipulation and our own addiction to indulgence and laziness play huge roles in the decisions we make.